What if the truest measure of knowledge is not what we explain, but what we quietly leave in the dark? Across centuries, people have stood at the edge of the known world and listened for an answer. Sometimes they found a formula, a fossil, a map. And sometimes they found something less obedient, a sound with no visible source, a light that lingered too long in the sky, a signal that arrived from far beyond the reach of ordinary certainty. In each case, the first response was wonder. The second was doubt. This is not a story about proving the impossible. It is a story about the fragile border between curiosity and caution, about the moments when human beings encounter something that does not fit neatly inside the instruments, language, or institutions built to contain reality. We like to imagine science as a lantern carried bravely into the unknown, and often it is. But lanterns cast shadows too. The mysteries ahead are not simply tales of strange events. They are reflections of us, of our need to name things before we trust them, of our discomfort when evidence arrives without permission, without theory, without a place prepared for it. Some of these phenomena may someday find ordinary explanations. Some may dissolve under better measurement. Others may remain unresolved, not because they are unreal, but because reality has always been larger than our confidence. In quiet valleys, on ocean floors, in sealed rooms, and across deep space, questions continue to wait. Not dramatic questions, but enduring ones. What do we do with an observation that unsettles the frame? What happens when disbelief becomes a habit rather than a method? And how much of human history is shaped not only by discovery, but by hesitation? Every age has its blind spots. Every civilization has its silences. This journey begins there, in that uneasy space between evidence and acceptance, where mystery is not the enemy of knowledge, but its oldest companion. What if the Earth itself could remember a sound no one was meant to hear? In the summer of 1997, deep in the southern Pacific Ocean, hydrophones drifted in their patient watch beneath the waves. These instruments had been built to listen for submarines, for the language of machines moving silently through the cold dark. Instead, they caught something vast. A low, rising pulse rolled across the water, powerful enough to be detected thousands of miles apart, as if the ocean had taken a long breath and spoken in a voice too large for any visible body. The signal came to be known simply as the Bloop, a name that sounds almost playful until you imagine it traveling through black water where sunlight never reaches. For a brief moment, speculation moved faster than certainty. Some wondered if the sound belonged to an undiscovered animal, a creature of impossible scale hidden in the last great wilderness on Earth. Others resisted the temptation. The ocean, after all, is full of deceptions: ice cracking, pressure shifting, continents whispering through the seafloor. Years later, many researchers would point toward ice quakes, the groaning fracture of Antarctic ice, as the most likely source. It was a measured answer, reasonable and restrained. Yet the fascination never quite disappeared. Not because people preferred fantasy to fact, but because the event revealed how little intimacy we truly have with our own planet. We have mapped the surfaces of Mars with extraordinary care, while much of the deep ocean remains a darkness described more often by metaphor than by measurement. The Bloop endures because it was never only about a sound. It was about scale, about humility, about the unsettling realization that the world still contains rooms we have barely entered. And perhaps that is what the sea has always offered us. Not certainty, but perspective. A reminder that the unknown is not always somewhere far away among the stars. Sometimes it is here beneath us, moving through the oldest waters on Earth, asking whether mystery begins where knowledge ends, or where listening finally becomes deep enough. What if the sky could produce a lightning bolt that left no thunder behind, only questions? Pilots have described it in fragments for decades. A sudden crimson bloom above a thunderstorm, tendrils of light climbing upward instead of falling down. For a moment, the atmosphere seems to reverse its own logic, as if the storm has opened a secret window toward space. These flashes are called red sprites, though the name can make them sound gentler than they are. In truth, they are brief, elegant disturbances written across the highest reaches of weather, visible only if one happens to be looking in the right direction at the right time. For years, many of these reports lived in the uneasy territory between anecdote and acceptance. Commercial pilots spoke of luminous shapes hovering above distant storms, but instruments were rarely aimed high enough to catch them. Science did not reject the stories with cruelty. It simply lacked a clear frame in which to place them. The familiar model of lightning was already crowded with equations, electric fields, and cloud dynamics. Upward flashes seemed like an intrusion from a different script. Then cameras finally caught them. What had sounded improbable became measurable. Red sprites, blue jets, and other transient luminous events entered the scientific vocabulary, not as myths corrected by reason, but as realities that had waited for technology to become patient enough to see them. Their discovery offered more than a meteorological footnote. It revealed how often the world remains invisible, not because it is hiding, but because our attention is aimed too low. We build our certainty around what our instruments expect to find. And when nature writes outside those expectations, we sometimes mistake our blindness for skepticism. There is something deeply human in that delay. We trust what repeats. We hesitate before the rare. Yet high above the storms, these strange bursts still flicker between atmosphere and space, reminding us that discovery is often a matter of perspective. The sky was never empty above the clouds. It was only waiting for us to look up, and to admit that wonder sometimes arrives long before explanation catches its breath. What if memory itself could leave an imprint on matter, not as proof, but as a trace too subtle to hold and too persistent to ignore? In laboratories and old houses alike, people have long told stories about places that seem to remember. A room where voices feel strangely suspended. A hallway that carries footsteps no one can account for. A recording that captures a phrase never heard in the moment, as though the air had briefly become an archive. These accounts are often grouped under a quiet and controversial phrase, electronic voice phenomena, or the broader idea that environments may preserve fragments of human presence in ways we do not yet understand. To many observers, the explanation is simple. Static becomes language because the mind is built to find patterns. Random noise bends toward meaning when grief, fear, or hope is close at hand. A hiss in an empty room can become a whisper if the listener is waiting for one. Science, careful by necessity, tends to stand on that side of the threshold. Without repeatable conditions, without a clear mechanism, such experiences remain outside the firm architecture of accepted knowledge. And yet the stories endure because they touch something older than belief. They raise the possibility that places are not empty stages, but participants in human life. Walls absorb sound. Tape gathers interference. Digital sensors catch more than intention. Most of the time, these are ordinary facts, but on rare occasions, the ordinary seems to lean toward the uncanny, and what should have vanished appears to linger. Perhaps the deeper mystery is not whether rooms can remember, but why humans need them to. We are creatures of echo. We return to old streets, old dwellings, old photographs, hoping that time has left behind some usable warmth. When something seems to answer back, even faintly, it feels less like evidence than companionship. So the question remains, unresolved and quietly powerful. Are these only artifacts of perception, shaped by longing and chance? Or do certain moments impress themselves upon the world more deeply than we know? Somewhere between signal and silence, the human heart keeps listening. What if the most revealing message from the universe arrived only once, and then refused to return? On an August night in 1907, a radio telescope in Ohio was doing what science often does best, waiting. It swept the sky methodically, undiabolically, listening to the quiet traffic of the cosmos, collecting patterns too faint for the human ear, but not beyond human imagination. Then, for 72 seconds, the silence changed. A narrowband signal rose sharply from the background, strong and clean, so striking that the astronomer, reviewing the printout, circled the data in red ink and wrote a single word beside it. Wow. The name stayed because the feeling stayed. The signal appeared to come from deep space, near the frequency long considered especially interesting in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. It was not a broadcast anyone could replay on command. It did not linger for a second observation. It came, peaked, and disappeared. That vanishing is part of what gave it power. A repeating anomaly becomes a problem to solve. A solitary one becomes a mirror for our longing. Over the years, researchers proposed many possibilities. A terrestrial interference source, an unusual astronomical event, even the drifting signature of a cometary cloud. None settled the matter completely. The wow signal remains suspended between explanation and enigma, not because science lacked discipline, but because the event offered so little to work with. One bright thread and Washington, darkness again. Yet the significance of that moment may not rest in whether it was a message from another intelligence. Its deeper meaning lies in what it exposed about us. Humanity has always listened outward with more than instruments. We listen with loneliness, with curiosity, with the suspicion that life should not end at the shoreline of Earth. The universe, however, is under no obligation to speak clearly. It offers bursts, fragments, hints carried across impossible distances. We answer with antennas, equations, and patience. And perhaps that is the quiet beauty of the search. Not that we have heard a voice, but that one strange signal was enough to remind us how ready we are to listen, and how much of hope is built from a single moment that refuses to become ordinary. What if an entire city could sit at the bottom of the sea, not as a lost civilization proved beyond doubt, but as a question shaped like stone? Off the western coast of Japan, near Yonaguni Island, divers descend through clear blue water and meet a structure that does not behave like ordinary expectation. There are broad terraces, sharp edges, long descending steps, and surfaces that seem almost intentionally arranged. In photographs, it looks less like a reef than a monument, something severe, something patient, something that appears at first glance to remember hands. Since its discovery, the Yonaguni Formation has lived in a fragile balance between geology and imagination. Some researchers argue that it is a natural sandstone structure, fractured and sculpted over time by currents, seismic activity, and the slow discipline of the sea. Others see signs of human modification, or even the possibility of an ancient site touched by a civilization long vanished beneath rising waters. The debate remains unsettled, and perhaps that uncertainty is precisely why the formation continues to hold the mind. Underwater mysteries carry a special weight because the ocean changes the emotional temperature of evidence. Ruins on land invite archaeology. Shapes beneath water invite elegy. We see depth and begin telling stories about memory, catastrophe, and the fragile shelf on which history rests. The sea becomes not only a location, but a metaphor for everything forgotten before writing, before maps, before the confidence of record keeping. Whether Yonaguni is natural, altered, or something in between, it reminds us that human beings are drawn to patterns that suggest intention. We want history to leave architecture behind. We want the past to become visible in corners and angles. Sometimes that desire reveals something real. Sometimes it reveals the architecture of the mind itself. Still, the image endures, stone steps descending into blue silence, as if leading toward a chapter no one can fully read. And perhaps that is why the site matters. Not because it proves a lost world, but because it asks how much of the past has been erased, how much remains hidden, and whether the line between discovery and projection is as deep and shifting as the sea itself. What if the human mind could change the world around it, not through force or invention, but through attention alone? For much of the 20th century, small laboratories and quieter corners of academia returned again and again to a troubling possibility. That consciousness might not be as sealed inside the skull as we prefer to think. The experiments were usually modest. A person sits in front of a machine designed to produce random outcomes. Numbers rise and fall, lights flicker. A pattern is expected to remain patternless. And yet, over many trials, some researchers believed they saw a faint but persistent deviation, as though intention had leaned gently against chance. The subject came to be known by various names, from psychokinesis to mind-matter interaction. Those labels carried baggage almost immediately. For critics, the problem was obvious. Extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence, and statistical anomalies are fragile things. They can emerge from flawed design, selective reporting, unconscious bias, or the sheer human hunger to discover meaning where none exists. Mainstream science, wary of self-deception, kept its distance. But the fascination did not fade, because the question beneath the experiments was never merely technical. It was existential. Are thought and matter truly separate realms, or have we drawn that boundary too sharply? Even if the observed effects were tiny, even if they proved to be artifacts of method Rather than evidence of hidden capacity, the impulse to ask was unmistakably human. We want to know whether awareness is passive or whether it participates more deeply in the world than our current models allow. There is something tender in that longing, a wish that the inner life matters beyond private experience, a hope that attention itself leaves a mark. Most likely the universe remains indifferent to our desires. Coins land as they will, machines obey physics, not yearning. And yet the mystery persists because it speaks to a larger truth. Human beings do not only study reality. We ache to belong inside it, to feel that our thoughts are not just observers passing through, but threads in the larger fabric. So the question remains suspended, delicate and unresolved. Not whether the mind can command matter like myth, but whether consciousness is stranger, quieter, and more entangled with the world than we have yet learned to measure. What if a photograph could capture not a ghost, but the moment when technology and longing begin to blur into each other? In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as cameras became more common and the modern world learned to trust the image, another strange chapter emerged beside the rise of photographic science. Families grieving a recent death would sit for portraits and later discover, or believe they discovered, a faint figure behind them, a face in the curtain, a pale hand resting where no hand had been. In an age when photography seemed almost miraculous, these spirit images arrived with a special force. They appeared objective, mechanical, indisputable. The camera, unlike memory, was not supposed to dream. Some of these images were later exposed as frauds, created through double exposure, careful staging, or darkroom manipulation. Others were likely accidents of chemistry and light, innocent distortions elevated by sorrow into revelation. But the phenomenon matters for more than its authenticity. It reveals what happens when a new tool enters human life carrying the promise of truth. We do not only use such tools to measure the world, we also recruit them into our private grief, our hope, our refusal to let absence be final. That is why spirit photography remains haunting, even after many of its mechanisms are understood. It was never only about deception. It was about desire meeting machinery at exactly the right historical moment. A time when science was offering new powers of observation, while mourning still searched for language large enough to contain its ache. The result was a strange visual frontier where evidence and emotion stood side by side. Perhaps every era creates its own version of this. We bring our newest instruments to our oldest questions. We ask cameras, recordings, algorithms, and screens to do more than function. We ask them to reassure us that what we have loved does not vanish entirely. And maybe that is the quieter lesson hidden inside those faded images. Not that the dead were proven to remain, but that human beings will always reach toward continuity, even through glass and silver and shadow. Sometimes the mystery is not in what the photograph shows. It is in why we need the image to answer back. What if the body could know something before the mind had time to understand it? In controlled rooms, under fluorescent lights and the careful gaze of researchers, experiments have sometimes asked a deceptively simple question. Can the human nervous system react to an event a fraction of a second before that event is consciously perceived? A person sits before a screen. Images appear in random order, some neutral, some emotionally charged. Sensors track heartbeat, skin conductance, breathing. According to ordinary expectation, the body should respond after the image arrives. Yet in certain studies, subtle shifts seem to come just before, as if the body were leaning into the future by an almost immeasurable amount. This idea has been called presentiment, a word that sounds older than the laboratories in which it was tested. For supporters, the results suggest that consciousness may not move through time as neatly as we assume. For critics, the explanation is more grounded and more familiar. Methodological flaws, statistical noise, publication bias, the tendency of extraordinary interpretations to gather around weak effects. The debate has remained unresolved, and because the observed differences are so small, certainty remains difficult to claim from either side. Still, the subject lingers because it touches a nerve deeper than experimental design. Most people know the feeling of sensing a call before the phone rings, or turning just before a sudden interruption, or feeling a wave of unease without knowing why. Usually such moments can be explained by coincidence, pattern recognition, or memory's habit of keeping the hits and discarding the misses. But now and then, experience leaves behind a quieter question. Does the body notice more than awareness can immediately narrate? Perhaps that is the true center of this mystery, not prophecy, not magic, but timing. The possibility that perception is layered and that what we call the present is less a single instant than a field of signals arriving at different depths. If that is true, even in a limited way, then human experience may be more fluid than our clocks suggest. And if it is not, the desire to believe it may still reveal something essential, that we have never felt fully at home inside linear time, and some part of us is always listening for what comes next before it has a name. What if the strangest maps of the human body are the ones that describe places no scalpel has ever found? For generations, traditional healing systems have spoken of channels through which vitality moves, routes too subtle for ordinary anatomy, yet central to the experience of balance, pain, and recovery. In Chinese medicine, these pathways are called meridians. They do not appear in the body the way bones, nerves, or blood vessels do. They belong to a different kind of cartography, one built from sensation, observation, in centuries of practice rather than from dissection alone. To many modern minds, that makes them difficult to trust. And yet the map has endured. Acupuncture, one of the most visible expressions of this tradition, has occupied an unusual place between skepticism and acceptance. Some patients report profound relief. Some clinical trials suggest measurable benefits for certain types of pain and nausea. Others find the evidence inconsistent, vulnerable to placebo effects, study design problems, or the challenge of isolating exactly why any treatment works. The language of meridians remains especially controversial because it does not fit easily inside the explanatory framework of contemporary biomedicine. But perhaps the tension reveals something larger than a dispute over technique. It shows how different civilizations build knowledge from different starting assumptions. One tradition asks where the tissue is damaged, which receptor is firing, which molecule is missing. Another asks where energy is blocked, where rhythm has faltered, where the person has lost internal harmony. These are not always mutually exclusive questions. Sometimes they are different doors opening onto the same suffering. Science is strongest when it measures clearly. Human healing, however, often begins in places that are harder to quantify. Expectation, touch, ritual, attention, relationship. To acknowledge that is not to abandon rigor. It is to admit that the body may be more than the sum of its visible parts. So the mystery of meridians is not merely whether invisible channels literally exist. It is whether our current models of health are complete enough to describe all that people genuinely experience. Somewhere between nerve and metaphor, between tissue and meaning, another kind of anatomy may still be waiting for a language both precise and humane enough to see it. What if the mind's most intimate experiences are not created by the brain alone, but touched by something we do not yet know how to measure? There are moments, often reported in whispers rather than declarations, when people describe leaving the ordinary boundaries of self. A patient on an operating table speaks later of floating above the room. Someone close to death recalls a tunnel, a presence, a radiance more real than waking life. Others tell of consciousness continuing for a brief and impossible interval when the body should have been slipping into silence. These accounts, gathered across hospitals, cultures, and decades, are usually placed under a careful phrase: near-death experiences. Science approaches such testimonies with understandable restraint. Oxygen loss, neurochemical surges, temporal lobe activity, memory reconstruction, and the profound stress of trauma can all shape perception in ways that feel absolute from the inside. The brain under pressure is capable of astonishing distortions and consolations. That may explain much of what people report, and yet for many who have lived through such episodes, the experience resists being filed away as mere malfunction. It changes them. Their fear of death softens. Their priorities shift. They return not with proof, but with a different relationship to existence. That transformation may be the most important fact of all. Whether these moments reveal an afterlife, a final theater of the brain, or some still unclear meeting point between biology and consciousness, they expose how incomplete our language remains when speaking about the border between living and dying. We know how to monitor pulse, respiration, electrical activity. We know far less about the texture of awareness as it nears the edge. Perhaps that is why these stories persist. They do not hand us certainty. They hand us humility. In the end, the mystery is not only what people see when death draws near. It is why that threshold, even when explained in physical terms, continues to awaken such profound clarity, as though the closing door of life sometimes opens inward, revealing not an answer but a deeper question about what it has meant to be alive at all. What if the planet carries scars we have noticed, measured, and named, yet still do not fully understand? Across Siberia, the Arctic, and other remote regions, the ground itself has begun to surprise us. Craters appear where flat Earth once stretched unbroken. Circular openings tear into the tundra as if something beneath the surface had gathered pressure in silence for years, then suddenly decided it could wait no longer. Scientists can describe parts of the process: thawing permafrost, trapped methane, unstable soil, a climate system shifting faster than many communities can track in live memory. And yet, each new rupture still arrives with a faint sense of disbelief, because the land seems to be acting out a drama larger than any single explanation. These events are not supernatural. They belong to geology, chemistry, and warming temperatures. But the emotional force they carry comes from somewhere deeper than technical description. They remind us that Earth is not a static backdrop for human history. It is an active participant, layered with pressures and feedback loops that can remain hidden until they erupt into view. We prefer the ground beneath us to symbolize stability. A crater interrupts that story. In another age, such openings might have been read as omens. Today, they are studied with drones, satellite imagery, gas analysis, and climate models. This is progress, and necessary progress. Yet even the best measurements do not remove the unease. They sharpen it, because once the mystery begins to yield, it often reveals not comfort, but responsibility. The unknown becomes a warning written in terrain. That may be the real significance of these sudden wounds in the earth. They show that some mysteries are not distant curiosities waiting politely for investigation. Some are consequences emerging from conditions we have helped create, asking whether knowledge arrived early enough to matter. So we stand at the rim and look down, not into legend, but into process, into a world changing in ways that are both explainable and profoundly unsettling. And the question that follows is no longer whether the earth is speaking. It is whether we have learned to hear change before it breaks the surface and leaves a mark too large to ignore. What if the rarest discoveries are not the ones hidden from us, but the ones we dismiss because they arrived too early for belief? Throughout history, there have been observations that hovered at the edge of legitimacy for years before science found a way to hold them. Stones once thought impossible falling from the sky. Continental drift mocked before it redrew the map of Earth. Invisible microorganisms dismissed until lenses improved and habits changed. Again and again, knowledge has advanced not only through discovery, but through the slow correction of certainty. The pattern is humbling. Reality does not depend on our readiness. This is the quiet thread connecting every mystery in this journey. Strange oceanic sounds, luminous storms above storms, signals from the dark, unusual responses of body and mind, traces that seem to linger in matter, landscapes that resemble lost histories. Some of these may eventually settle into ordinary explanation. Some may remain unresolved because the evidence is too thin, the methods too blunt, or the phenomenon too elusive. But all of them expose the same tension: the difference between healthy skepticism and reflexive refusal. Science needs doubt. Without it, speculation hardens into superstition. But doubt has its own shadow. It can become a shield against discomfort, a way of protecting current models from inconvenient possibilities. To study the unknown honestly requires a rarer discipline: openness without gullibility, rigor without arrogance, imagination without surrender. That balance is difficult because human beings are vulnerable on both sides. We are too quick to believe beautiful stories and sometimes too proud to notice when the world is quietly revising ours. Perhaps that is why mysteries endure in the cultural imagination. Not because they guarantee hidden truths, but because they remind us that knowledge is a living process, not a finished monument. Each unanswered question leaves a space in which humility can grow. And maybe that is the real invitation here. Not to chase wonder at the expense of evidence, nor to worship evidence so completely that wonder becomes embarrassing, but to remain teachable. To remember that history is filled with moments when the improbable was simply the real, arriving before language, before consensus, before the rest of us learned how to see it. What remains, after all the signals and shadows, is not a catalog of unsolved curiosities. It is a portrait of human beings standing before the unfinished. We began with a simple tension, the distance between what we encounter and what we can confidently explain. Along the way, the ocean spoke in a voice too large to identify. The upper sky flashed with forms once treated as rumor. A radio signal crossed space and vanished before it could be understood. Stone beneath the sea resembled intention. The body seemed at moments to know more than conscious thought could easily account for. Grief reached through cameras and empty rooms. Ancient healing maps resisted dismissal. Near death, some returned with stories that changed the meaning of life more than the fact of death. Even the ground itself opened, reminding us that mystery is not always ancient. Sometimes it is arriving now. None of this gives us permission to abandon rigor. If anything, it asks for greater care. The unknown deserves better than sensationalism. It deserves patience, discipline, and the courage to say both yes and no at the right times. To say yes when evidence widens the frame. To say no when desire rushes ahead of truth. Most of all, it asks us to remain aware that knowledge is not only a collection of answers, but a way of meeting uncertainty without turning away. Perhaps that is why these stories stay with us. They are not really about anomalies. They are about proportion. They remind us that even now, in an age of satellites, supercomputers, and molecular precision, reality still exceeds the structures we build to describe it. There is no shame in that. In fact, there may be dignity in it. A civilization becomes wiser not when it claims to have solved everything, but when it learns how to keep listening. So the final question is not whether every mystery will one day be explained. Some will, some may not. Hey. The deeper question is what kind of people we become while facing them. Do we harden into certainty, or do we let wonder and discipline walk together, carrying us forward into a future where truth is not something we conquer, but something we learn again and again to approach with humility?